Namaste. Today, we're going to address the very interesting, a little complicated topic of Vedanta. Vedanta is very central to the Bhagavad Gītā because the Bhagavad Gītā is one of the triple foundations of Vedanta, known as the Prasthana Trayi, along with the Brahma Sutra and the Upanishads. Vedanta is the basis of the mainstream of the Indian philosophical and mystical tradition, which refers to it as a source and ultimate authority. So this lecture today is engaged with the nature of Vedantic knowledge, or jnana, in the Bhagavad Gītā. This type of knowledge is generally considered intuitive, psychological, and mystical, and as such, non-philosophical, that is devoid of a rational structure. A recurring argument as to why the Upanishads in general might not be considered philosophy is that they do not contain a unified or systematic position. This, however, largely reflects the composite and fragmented nature of the text. Moreover, the teachers portrayed in Upanishads do not seem to make linear arguments that start with premises and build to larger conclusions, but rather tend to make points through analogies and metaphors, with many core ideas presented as truth or insights known to particular teachers, not as logical propositions that can be independently verified. However, although the Gita is indeed an integral part of Vedanta tradition, it is also unique in that it is as opposed to the other two components of the Prasthana Trayi, that is the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutra. It develops the humanistic realm and is deeply grounded in Dharma. Also, as the scholar Van Buitenen surmises, it may be that this universal acceptance of the revelatory relevance of the Gita that makes it so unique. This lecture argues that as opposed to the Upanishads, the unique structure of the Bhagavad Gītā allows a categorization and characterization of this knowledge in the generally accepted philosophical terms of ethics, ontology, and epistemology. So that is our major argument here. Moreover, this lecture argues that the Gita's concept of jnana, or knowledge, is systematic and unified, but as opposed to the generally accepted philosophical practice that makes linear arguments that start with premises and build to larger conclusions. This type of knowledge is not linear, but hierarchical, and that it leads to higher and higher states of being and consciousness, which could be considered mystical. Moreover, the Bhagavad Gītā has its own epistemic system, according to which it differentiates philosophical knowledge based upon linear arguments from mystical knowledge, which is considered in different terms. Following such an epistemic discussion, this lecture proceeds to articulate the concept of hierarchical reality underlying the Gita, and as such describes three metaphysical layers representing three types of knowledge, that is humanistic knowledge, yogic Upanishadic knowledge, and liberated knowledge. This three-story model reveals the unique Vedantic structure of the Gita, and along with the ethical ladder described in the chapter, or the chapter 4, or the lecture about yoga in the Bhagavad Gītā, it comprises the three-story house model representing this structure of the Bhagavad Gītā. The articulation of the three-story model enables the categorization of the Vedantic knowledge in the Gita. Accordingly, it is mainly second story, but also third story types of knowledge. Having characterized this hierarchical epistemic structure, the chapter is engaged with the various, or the lecture is engaged with the various aspects of such knowledge. As such, it is engaged with desire, passion, as obscuring jnana, and throwing the living entity into delusion. It characterizes as siddhati, the person who is firmly established in meditation while withdrawing the senses from their objects. It is engaged with the parable of the inverted tree, which describes the state of the soul's entanglement in this world of samsara and calls for determined action of freeing oneself from the world of detachment by detachment, and then searching for the liberated world. And it then describes the state of samsara, bringing together the living entity, nature, and the Supreme Person within. At last, we may offer various visions that may be considered darshan, or direct experience of the truth, and these are highlighted. So I hope that you can follow upon this lecture, which is a little complicated, no doubt, but I think it is interesting and very, very important for the understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. Before looking into the nature of Vedantic knowledge, a brief discussion of the Gita's epistemology is offered. Epistemology, in general, is engaged with the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope. The Gita has its own epistemological assumptions, differentiating mystical or sattvic from argumentative or rajasic categories of knowledge. I've mentioned that in our previous lecture on Sankhya in the Bhagavad Gita. Now I'm reading from chapter 18. This is a division of knowledge into the three gunas, and that is the Gita's epistemology. 18:20. Know that knowledge to be of the nature of goodness, through which one sees a single imperishable reality in all beings, unified in the diversified. Know that knowledge to be of the nature of passion, through which one sees through division a variegated reality of many sorts in all beings. So this is very interesting. I present here only two, not the three gunas, but only two types of knowledge, sattvic and rajasic. So apparently, the first category of knowledge, which is defined as sattvic or transparent, is the mystical category referring to the Upanishads. And this is the Upanishadic type of knowledge. This type of knowledge is characterized by seeing a single imperishable reality in all beings, unified in the diversified. Apparently, this refers to a vision of the Atman and rebirth, to the existence of Brahman, and to other such visions. The second category, or type of knowledge, is defined as rajasic or passionate. This type of knowledge is characterized by seeing through division, a variegated reality of many sorts in all beings. Apparently, this vision of variegated reality underlies the philosophical argumentative method, making linear arguments that start with premises and build to larger conclusions. The conclusion of this short discussion is that it is indeed true that the mystical type of knowledge is not based upon arguments and counter-arguments, as from the Gita's point of view, argumentative knowledge is a lower type of knowledge based upon a variegated perception of reality as opposed to a unified one. Okay, we may not offer here a full survey of the Vedanta. That's an interesting topic about the Vedantic schools of thought with different forms of monism, Advaita Vedanta, through all kinds of dualistic systems characterized by Beda Abeda, the view that reality is both different and non-different, and Dvaita. We have different systems which I will not survey here, but I will raise the question about Vedantic knowledge, and the question is, can this non-argumentative, sattvic, Vedantic knowledge be categorized or defined? In general, the Upanishadic texts were often called rahasya, or secretive, as they were supposed to be learned only by specially selected students, which explains their often less well-preserved state of transmission. These deal with the eternal problems of humankind That is, where do we come from? Why are we here? Where do we go? In other words, with the nature of the body and soul, their fate after death, and their position in the universe. This is by a scholar called Witzel, very famous scholar from Harvard. Klaus Klostermaier, who was my supervisor in Oxford, and I owe him a lot. He considers it very difficult to express Vedantic knowledge or the way leading to it, as knowledge and the way in the Indian understanding have stages, not set side by side, but within each other, in depth, within consciousness itself. Its aim is to reach reality itself, go deeper, not to abstract a concept from it. This means the training not only of the mind, but the development of lifestyle of inwardness from within, which life then develops in a new way, whose knowledge is simply incommensurable with the knowledge achieved through sense perception and abstraction from it. You see, it's a different type of knowledge. This Vedantic knowledge, this Upanishadic knowledge is different. It works differently. It has different underlying assumptions. That's a discussion here. It's a little complicated, but it's very, very interesting. Human existence has not only a horizontal, historical dimension, but a vertical, non-historical dimension as well. To cope with the actual human existence, this movement towards the center, the attainment of a level of consciousness of the self, is indispensable. Upanishadic thinking rests and is static as far as the outward movement and change and topic are concerned. For people unused to probing this depth, this vertical movement does not lead further and is considering uninteresting. There's no visible progress and one needs time and patience. So that is by Klaus Klostermaier, and it speaks, I think, in a very deep way about the nature of Upanishadic knowledge. So, considering all the above said, it is evident that this type of knowledge should not be considered in linear terms, as these terms fail to grasp its essence and its movements towards internalization or ascension of consciousness towards higher mystical states. As such, we propose to categorize this type of knowledge in hierarchical terms, which are inherent in the Vedantic mode of discourse. These terms may well grasp the ascending movement of this type of knowledge and can articulate it in a generally accepted philosophical terms. So now I'm looking into hierarchical nature of reality. The idea of reality divided into grades, some of them being obscured and concealed and not perceived by the senses, or perhaps perceived but given a different interpretation, is at the heart of Vedantic mysticism. Apparently, this idea of divided reality containing different realms seems to be grounded already in the Upanishads. Anyhow, I will go a little further and perhaps quote Shlomo Biderman, also an Israeli scholar. He recognizes two principal metaphysical positions in Indian philosophy in general, which he designates as the direct realistic and the hierarchical. He differentiates the direct realistic and the hierarchical. These two positions differ by their perception of reality. The former considers reality to be unified, whereas the latter considers reality to contain different levels or tiers. Interesting. Moreover, these tiers, levels, or stories are designated as lower and higher. Apparently, taking the supreme reality of Brahman as the reference point, the closer the perception is to Brahman, the higher it is. So that's a statement by Biderman. He also was my MA supervisor. And he divides reality into direct realistic, which is what most people consider, in hierarchical, layer by layer. That's the direction I'm going with the three-story house model. And this lecture is aiming at unveiling this hierarchy of a metaphysical existence or points of view. Anyhow, so we have here various scholars speaking about this, and it is also part of the yogi tradition that reality is divided into layers. So it's actually inherent or natural for Indian thought and, of course, Hindu thought. So now we're going to be discussing the three-story house model, and we will start by quoting a very famous scholar, I think I mentioned him a few times, Van Buitenen. And he draws a clear distinction between dharma values and moksha values in Indian thought. So we would like to follow this categorization and apply the terminology dharma and moksha to the two levels reality concept. As such, the first level of reality, which is empirical and conventional, changing, finite, and representative of the human or worldly condition, may be termed the level of dharma. This is the lower humanistic level, underlying the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gītā. The second level, which is absolute, permanent, and infinite, may be termed the level of moksha. That's the higher level, the realized level, out of which the Gita at times speaks. Ordinarily, mentioning dharma, its opposite term, adharma, ought to be referred to as well. Van Buitenen knows that moksha is released from the entire realm, which is governed by dharma, and as such it stands in opposition to dharma. However, the opposition is of another kind than that of adharma. If you see the point, there's opposition between dharma and adharma, and dharma and moksha. Dharma upholds established order, while adharma threatens it, as it is sheer lawlessness. Moksha, however, is the abandonment of the established order, not in favor of anarchy, but in favor of self-realization, which is precluded in the realm of dharma. Ordinarily, dharma and adharma are considered opposite terms. However, seen from the point of view of moksha, both dharma and adharma are in an entirely different category. According to our terminology, both dharma and adharma represent the finite or humanistic level, whereas moksha represents the infinite or liberated level, which is different altogether. Those two kinds of dichotomies between dharma and adharma and between dharma and moksha can be understood through a somewhat graphic description. The dichotomy between dharma and adharma may be taken as to be horizontal. The dichotomy between dharma as both exists within the same realm, whereas the dichotomy between both dharma and adharma and between moksha, this may be taken to be vertical. This is so as both dharma and adharma are situated in the worldly or finite level, whereas moksha is situated in a completely different and higher level, which is infinite and absolute. A problem arises in that the two levels or tiers underlying the Gita, which could be considered the finite and the infinite, or alternatively dharma and moksha, are unrelated to each other, as there is an insurmountable gap between them. Considering the Atman's journey from dharma to moksha, which is an underlying principle of the Vedanta tradition, there is a need for a third intermediate tier serving to connect the two tiers, which would otherwise be unrelated to each other due to the insurmountable gap separating the two. For this purpose, we suggest a tier of yoga. This intermediate or connecting level is characterized, on the one hand, by an effort to distance oneself from the humanistic level by detachment, and on the other hand, by an effort to yoke or connect oneself to the higher and absolute reality, whether it is a supreme person or an abstract absolute. As such, we propose a metaphysical division of the Gita's underlying reality into three realms or tiers. So I'll share screen because I wanted to see that, these three levels. And the first one is the humanistic realm of Dharma. The second one is the spiritualistic realm of yoga. And the third one is the liberated realm of moksha. So this, I argue, as a main argument of my work, this represents the three tiers in the Bhagavad Gita. And you have to understand that. We have to understand the Gita's knowledge, how, from which point of view the Bhagavad Gita speaks. Sometimes the Bhagavad Gita speaks from the first tier, sometimes from the second tier, and sometimes from the third tier. So the first tier represents Dharma and furthers proper human life. The second tier represents yoga and Upanishadic jnana and furthers attempts to escape the vicious state of samsara while gradually seeking hold of the state of moksha. And the third tier represents the state of moksha itself and is also within the realm of Upanishadic jnana. Apparently, each tier represents different levels of consciousness, different psychological states, and in fact, different existential states of being. So I hope you see different states, different languages, different underlying assumptions. The question may be raised, could these great tiers of stories, which seem to be characteristics of the Vedanta school, be rationalized, defined, and articulated in humanistic and non-mystical terms or accepted philosophical terms? Is it possible to articulate or construct a conceptual bridge, so to speak, between rational and humanistic philosophy and the mystical Vedantic concept of reality? Is it possible to categorize different grades of consciousness and psychological states of mind in non-mystical terms? We propose that in order to distinguish the tiers from each other, their underlying assumptions in terms of values and being may be examined, corresponding to the categories of ethics and ontology. It may well be that the categories of ethics and ontology may serve as a foundation for this kind of bridge, connecting rational and humanistic ontology with mystical Vedanta. In attempting to uncover the underlying ethical assumptions of the first and humanistic tier, that of Dharma, it seems that the general rule in terms of values is to prosper. As such, worldly happiness and prosperity, they are desired and are good. In attempting to uncover the underlying ontological assumptions of this first humanistic tier, it seems that in terms of being, the individual is defined as a human being or any other living being, such as an animal, plant, or other. The second tier seems to maintain different underlying assumptions. In this tier, the value of worldly prosperity is rejected in favor of detachment and indifference to both worldly happiness and distress alike. Moreover, in this state, there is not only an effort to detach oneself from the world, along with its variegated manifestations, but also to yoke oneself to the higher and liberated reality, that of moksha. As such, there is an observable difference between the ethics of the first and second tiers. Apparently, first tier humanistic values consider prosperity to be good and desired, whereas the second tier spiritualistic values are utterly different, as they consider prosperity to be an obstacle to the state of equal-mindedness or samatva. The second tier is also different in terms of ontology or being. Apparently, first tier humanistic ontology considers the individual person to be a human or other being, whereas the second tier spiritualistic ontology considers the individual person or subject to be an eternal spiritual soul or Atman, wandering through samsara. Thus, the individual's subjective identity is not any longer that of a human being, rather that of an eternal spiritual soul or self. In the third tier, Another change of terms takes place. In the realm of ethics, the values of indifference, non-attachment, and equanimity are replaced by a new set of values. These are the experience of Brahman and Dao, or the bliss of Brahman, or alternatively, deep emotions of love and subordination directed towards the Supreme Person. As far as ontology or being is concerned, another change takes place. The spiritual soul of the second tier becomes not only pure existence and one with Brahman, but assumes the identity of pure servant and lover of the Supreme Person, or the minute person in relation to the Supreme Person. The three tiers represent internal mental states or attitudes. Thus, one who sees the world from the point of view of the first tier is convinced that he or she is a human being and that his or her aim is to prosper. Similarly, one who sees the world from the point of view of the second tier is convinced that he is an embodied spiritual self and that his aim is to get released from that condition. One who resides in the third tier may realize his oneness with Brahman, alternatively see the Supreme in person everywhere and aspire to serve and love him. We suggest the terminology of a three-story house as a metaphor, with each tier representing a separate story or tier. Each such story or tier contains unlimited existential opportunities and paths. Moreover, the residents of each story have their own language, terms, and underlying assumptions that are different from those of other stories' residents. In a sense, the Gita speaks in three different languages, terms, and underlying assumptions that are different from those of other stories' residents. In a sense, the Gita, speaks in three different languages and constantly moves between the three tiers. Once recognizing the story or tier from which the text is speaking, that section becomes intelligible and consistent with the rest of the treatise. On a more practical level, once recognizing one stage, it becomes apparent what the next stage of progress is. These distinctions may appear to be somewhat sharp, whereas in the text itself, the connecting links between the stories or tiers. However, this could possibly be compared to the study of grammar, where tables of roots and stems are articulated and discussed. Although these linguistic forms are merely theoretical or structural and do not appear in actual spoken language, they actually underlie it. Similarly, the distinction between the tiers underlies the text, although in the text itself, these distinctions may not always be easy to inspect. These ideas may be better demonstrated by textual references. The following example demonstrates how the text shifts from the first story to the second. When Arjuna argues against fighting the war, he does so from the position of the first story and says, so now this is the first story speech. Now, this is Arjuna speaking from the first story point of view, the humanistic point of view. Arjuna says, when adharma overpowers the family and its ladies become corrupt, O Krishna, and when the women become corrupt, there is miscegenation of classes. Surely miscegenation among classes leads to both the clans, destroyers, and the family itself to hell. I will share screen so you can see where I'm reading. Yeah, so I'm reading from the first chapter. The family ancestors fall too, deprived of their due offerings and sanctified food and water. As such, the evil deeds of the destroyers, which lead to miscegenation among classes, wipe out eternal caste and the family dharma. O Janardana, we have heard that hell awaits those whose family dharma has been obliterated. Alas, resolved are we on committing great evil, if we intend to kill our own people out of greed for royal pleasure. Better had I been killed on the battlefield, unarmed and unresisting by Dhritarashtra's sons, and weapons in their hands. So that is Arjuna's speech in the first chapter, and I argue that this is mainly from the humanistic, the first level, the first point of view. This section may be examined according to two parameters mentioned, values and being. As far as values, it is clear that underlying Arjuna's speech is a desire for worldly prosperity. He believes that prosperity is good and objects to the war which would cause the decline of Dharma, the rise of Adharma, and the infliction of suffering upon all involved and beyond. As far as being is concerned, Arjuna thinks of himself and others as human beings. In answering Arjuna, Krishna doesn't address his concerns directly, but raises the conversation to the second story. And he says, see, it's very interesting. Rise from the first story discussion to the second story. Let's see what Krishna says to 11. While speaking words of wisdom, you lament for that which is not to be grieved for. Wise are those who do not lament either for the living nor for the dead. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to exist. As childhood, youth, and old age before the soul within the body, so it comes to acquire another body. The wise is not swayed by illusion in this matter. Very interesting. Heat, cold, happiness, and distress, sensual perception alone produces them all, and it is impermanent, coming and going. You should seek to endure them, O Bharata. The wise one whom these do not disturb, who thus remains even tempered in both happiness and distress, is fit for immortality, of bull among men. Atvevaham jatunasam natvanebe janapitaha janadipaha nachevana bhavishyamaha sarve vayamata param dehinosminyata dehe kumaram yovanam jara tata deha antara praptir dirastatra na muyati. Very famous verses. So, yeah, that's this very famous verse. One more. Matras parshas tukuntaya shitoshna sukha dukada agama paino nityas tam stitiksha subharata. That's verse 14. So, anyhow, that's this transition from the first to the second story. I hope you can see this transition. I hope that you can see that the conversation here shifts points of view. Apparently, it becomes clear that Krishna doesn't answer Arjuna's doubts directly, but performs a kind of a Copernican revolution by changing the conversation's underlying assumptions and point of view. Arjuna, on his part, he argues that killing his relatives is bad. This is an obvious first story, humanistic statement that assumes that people are subjected to death and that death is always to be avoided as far as possible for the sake of a prosperous life. Krishna shifts the conversation to a different or higher story altogether and speaks out of different assumptions. From this higher point of view, Krishna says that death does not exist at all. From his second story point of view, he doesn't see human beings subjected to death. Rather, he sees eternal spiritual souls, and as such doesn't see much logic in Arjuna's arguments. As far as values, Krishna challenges Arjuna's idea according to which worldly prosperity and happiness are good, to be desired, and by propounding the idea that it is indifference to both happiness and distress that is good and to be desired. You see, it's not happiness, but indifference, which is to be desired from the second story point of view. The first section cited represents the first story position, whereas the second cited represents a second story position. Now we may examine a different passage which represents the ascension from the second to the third story. This is the opening section of chapter 7. The section begins with Krishna inviting Arjuna to attach his mind to him and as such ascend to the third story and gain a vision of divinity. So now I'm looking at the point in the Gita where the conversation rises from the second to the third story. Chapter 7, the Blessed Lord said, O Partha, with your mind attached to me, being fixed in yoga and finding refuge in me, you can know me entirely and beyond doubt. Here now, I shall now reveal to you fully knowledge accompanied by realization. Having acquired this knowledge, nothing further in this world will remain to be known. Among thousands of men, hardly anyone strives for perfection, and even among those who have striven to achieve perfection, hardly anyone knows me in truth. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intellect, and ego, these 8 comprise my separated lower nature. But you should know that beside this lower nature, Almighty Ambravan, there's another higher nature of mine, comprised of spirit souls, by which this world is sustained. Realize that all entities have their source in these 2 natures. I am the origin of this entire universe and its dissolution too. O Dhananjaya, there exists nothing higher than me. Everything rests upon me as pearls are strung on a thread. I am the taste of water, O Kuntiya, and I am the light of the sun and the moon. I am the sacred syllable Om in all the Vedas, the sound and ether and humanity and man. The pure fragrance of the earth am I, and the brilliance in fire. I am the life of all beings, living beings, and the austerity of the ascetics. So a beautiful ascension to the third story. Famous verses, Manushyanam Sahasrashu Kashchid Yatati Siddhaye Yatatam Apisidhanam Kashin Mam Veti Tatvataha. Gumira pona lova yu kammano budireva cha hankara ityame bina prakritir ashtadaha parayam itastvanyam bina prakritim param jiva bhuta mahabaho yayedam bharyate jagat. And more verses. Mata parataram nanyat chidasti dhananjaya vaiprutam idam sarvam sutre maniganaiva. So that is the ascent to the third story, and that is indeed very interesting. The famous scholar R.C. Zehner, he's aware of that, and that here in this point there is a shift of point of view, and he points out that the change occurring here. He emphasized that in his very famous Bhagavad Gītā commentary published by Oxford University Press about 60 years ago or so. So now I have described the 3 stories or layers or tiers underlying the Bhagavad Gītā. The first humanistic realm, the second spiritualistic realm, and the third liberated realm. I call them the world of Dharma, the world of Yoga, and the world of Moksha. And I hope that it's actually very, very helpful in understanding the structure of the Bhagavad Gītā. So there are 2 components of my structure. There's the ladder and the 3 stories. So now I'm leaving this aside, and I'm going to be discussing various aspects of the jnana, the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gītā. And the first one is desire and passion as obscuring jnana. The question is, why are we not realized? Why don't we see all these visions? Why don't we have this Vedantic vision? And that will be a good point of departure to the nature of Vedantic knowledge. The description of desire and passion as obscuring jnana and throwing the living entity into delusion. This is, of course, a second story vision, underlying other sections calling self-restraint and sense control, which are compulsory for the attainment of jnana. So now we're going to have a second story discussion answering Arjuna's question, what is obstructing Upanishad Jnana in the Gita? So that's 336. Arjuna said, what is it that impels one to commit evil, even against his will, as if driven by force? O descendant of Vrishni. The blessed Lord said, it is lust, it is anger, originating from the passion guna. It is the great evil and the great devourer. Know that to be the enemy. Kama esha, krodha esha. Raja guna samudbhava mahashado mahapadma yinam yaverinam. So this is the real enemy. That's lust and passion. As fire is obscured by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, and as embryo is developed in the womb, so the living being is obscured by lust. This eternal enemy covers even the wise one's knowledge, or kuntiya, having taken the form of this insatiable fire, lust. It is said to abide in the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Through these it eludes the embodied soul and clouds its knowledge. Therefore, Buddha among Bharas, you should control the senses first, then destroy this evil, the destroyer of knowledge and insight. It is said that the senses are elevated, but above the senses is the mind. The intelligence is still higher than the mind, but superior even to the intelligence is the soul. O mighty armed Arjuna, knowing yourself as higher than the intelligence, let the self steady your mind and destroy the indomitable enemy that takes the form of lust. So this is a discussion or a question of what obscures Upanishadic knowledge. Why don't we have this knowledge? And the answer is simple. It is lust. We are lusty. We are covered by lust. At least some of us. And that is the reason why we cannot see this Upanishadic vision. Now, there's another very interesting discussion, which is there in the second chapter. Actually, Mahatma Gandhi, he considered that to be the essence of the Gita. And that is a description of the Sthitadi Muni, that person who's firmly established in meditation, enlightenment, who has realized the Upanishadic knowledge. So let us look into these very important verses. Arjuna asked, he was established in steady enlightenment and situated in samadhi, O Keshava. How can he be described? That enlightened one, how does he speak? How does he sit? And how does he walk? The blessed Lord said, when he forsakes all desires arising from the mind, becomes satisfied in the self and by the self alone, then he is said to have attained steady enlightenment. One, not agitated despite all kinds of distress, whose aspiration for happiness is gone, and who is devoid of passion, fear, and anger, such a sage is said to have attained steady enlightenment. He who is not attracted to anything, and having attained this or that, good or bad, does not rejoice, but is not averse either, his wisdom is firmly established. When one is able to withdraw his senses away from their objects under any circumstance, just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into the shell, his wisdom is firmly established. When the body abstains, the objects of the senses fade away, but the taste for them remains. However, even the taste fades away when one attains the vision of the Supreme. So this is a very beautiful passage, and that describes the person who abides in Samadhi. Samadhi is Stita, and he has firm knowledge, Stita Pragya. He's compared to a tortoise in that he is able to withdraw his senses away from their objects, just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into the shell. So this very well exemplifies the practice of jnana as firmly established in the second story, represented on the one hand by asceticism and detachment, and on the other hand by gaining a hold of and realizing Brahman. This section well exemplifies the ethos of jnana and its second story nature. It gave you desire as a binding force covering real knowledge. It highlights the ideal of equal-mindedness as opposed to the idea of worldly prosperity. And ontologically speaking, it refers to the subject not as a human being, rather as a spiritual self or Atman. So let's move a little further and let us look now into something which I really love, and that is the 15th chapter parable of the inverted tree. It well demonstrates the Upanishadic jnana and the second story along with its spirituality. It describes the state of the soul's entanglement in the world of samsara. It calls for determined action for freeing oneself from this world by detachment, and then for searching the liberated world. Having reached that liberated world, one should search for the Supreme Person and take refuge in him. I consider this to be the entire Bhagavad Gītā in 6 verses, the whole journey of the soul in but 6 verses. Beautiful. The Blessed Lord said, chapter 15, it is said that there exists an eternal Ashvata tree whose roots are above and its branches below. Its leaves are the Vedic hymns, and its knower is the knower of the Veda. The tree's branches, with sense objects as their sprouts, extend upward and downward and are nourished by the gunas. The tree's roots, which extend downward as well, are bound to activity in the human world. In this world, one cannot perceive the tree's form, nor its end, nor its origin, neither its foundation. Thus, this deeply rooted Ashvata tree is to be cut down with determination by the axe of detachment. Then one should search for that place which, having reached, one never returns, and there take refuge in the primeval person from whom the cosmic activity has emanated since time immemorial. Those who are free from pride and illusion, who have conquered the fault of attachment and are constantly absorbed in the Supreme Self, whose lusts have abated, and who are freed from the duality known as happiness and distress, not bewildered, they go to that eternal place. That place is not illuminated by the sun nor the moon, nor by fire. Having gone there, no one returns. That is my supreme abode. So this is a beautiful parable talking about the inverted tree, liberation from the world, searching for the Supreme Person and taking refuge in him. All these are to be found in this very rich section, merely 6 verses long. So we'll move a little further. And now we will look at the vision of samsara. That's all Vedantic visions, all Vedantic types of knowledge. So here I'm going to be reading from the 13th chapter. No material nature and the conscious entity to be both without beginning. Know too that the transformations as well as the gunas originate from material nature. It is said that material nature is the cause in the matter of producing causes and effects, and that the living entity is the cause in the matter of experiencing pleasure and pain. The living entity situated in material nature, experiences the gunas that are the product of material nature, while its association with the gunas is the cause of birth in a good or bad womb. The Supreme Personality Paramatman is said to exist in this body. He is the observing witness and the consenter. He is a supporter, he experiences everything and is the great Lord. Very interesting, seeing the Supreme Person in the heart. Upadrashtanu mantacha bharata bhokta maheshvara paramatmeti chap yukto desmin purusha para. He who thus knows the living entity, the material nature, and the gunas, no matter what his mode of existence is, he will not be reborn. So this is a beautiful vision of both Prakriti, material nature, the living entity, the Purusha, and it's a second story vision of Jnana. Also involves Sankhya terminology. The gunas comprise Prakriti. We have discussed them in the previous lecture. They're eternal and provide for the framework of actions and reactions within the which the living entity experiences karma. But let's leave the gunas aside. We already discussed the gunas and move forward. So now we're coming to third story visions. These are mystical visions, third story visions, and in general, the Jnana Upanishadic sections in the Gita are categorized as second story, in that they refer to detachment and equal-mindedness, refer to the subject as eternal self, and highlight the goal of liberation and relief from samsara. However, there are some examples of third story sections or statements which offer a vision beyond struggle. In other words, whereas the second story sections call for a struggle with the mind and senses, these third story sections or statements offer a vision beyond that struggle, and as such represent various forms of divinity. Such a section may be found in chapter 13, 12 to 18. I'm reading from chapter 13. So that's, I argue or claim to be visions of the third story, and these are visions beyond struggle. There's no struggle involved. They're described from a point of view of fullness and establishment in the third story. You see the Supreme Lord, who is equally situated in all beings, not perishing when these perish, truly sees. One who sees the Lord as situated equally everywhere does not degrade himself by his mind, and thus goes to the supreme destination. You see that all activities are performed by nature alone, and that the self does not act at all, truly sees. When one sees the being's various states of existence as situated in unity, and that from that unity everything extends, he then attains Brahman, the eternal Paramatman, the Supreme Person, residing in the heart, although residing in the body, does nothing at all and is never tainted, because of his being without beginning and beyond the gunas. As ether spreads everywhere without being tainted, as ether spreads everywhere without being tainted because of its subtleness, similarly the self abiding in every body is never tainted. As the sun alone illuminates the entire universe, similarly does the owner of the field illuminates the entire field with consciousness. O Bara, those who with the eye of knowledge can distinguish between the field and the knower of the field and understand the process of the entity's release from nature, he will go to the Supreme. So, what we heard here is Krishna and Arjuna with various visions. This is not a presentation of a systematic thesis. Rather, it is a darshana, or direct experience of truth so far presented theoretically. So that is very, 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 very interesting of these different visions. So I think we'll stop here. I try to, I would say, argue for the consistency of the Vedantic knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita. I brought a generally accepted point of view by scholars who say that the Upanishadic knowledge is not philosophical, in that it is not presenting arguments and counter-arguments. And then I brought the Gita's point of view, the Gita's epistemology, and saying that it's just this knowledge of arguments and counter-arguments represents Rajasic knowledge, whereas the Gita's knowledge is sattvic or unifying or mystical. So that was a discussion of the Gita's epistemology. Then I presented the three-story house model, and I divided reality into the world of Dharma, the world of yoga, and the world of moksha, and argued that each tier or story represents a full word in itself with terminology, underlying assumptions, ethics, ontology, and epistemology also. So that's necessary to understand this as underlying the structure of the Bhagavad Gita. And then finally, I brought different ideas supporting the idea of knowledge in the Bhagavad Gita, of jnana. I discussed lust as obscuring knowledge. I discussed the sthita pragya, the person firm in knowledge, discussed the parable of an inverted tree, describing the journey of the soul in 6 verses. I discussed some visions from the 13th chapter, and then at last some mystical visions representing the 3rd story. So thank you very, very much.